Hi, I'm Ozzy Hall. Welcome to another episode of Critical Race Issues Forum. Today, I want to talk to you about what they don't want you to know, what they don't want you to talk about, um, what they don't want to be presented in public education. When I was a small child in a segregated elementary school in Wilmington, Delaware, we had to learn the preamble to the United States Constitution. And the preamble started out with the words, "We the people," said, "We the people of the United States, we the people." And during that time, I would think of "we the people." This was a majestic type of document, the United States Constitution. I felt a sense of pride and patriotism in learning and being able to recite the preamble to the Constitution. And I became a person who was interested in learning more about the Constitution and understanding it. What they didn't tell me was that when the preamble and Constitution talked about "we the people," that originally it did not include Black people. And Black people, about 5,000 Black people, including slaves and free Blacks, fought in the Continental Army in order to make America a free nation. Also, the very first person to die in the cause of American freedom was a Black man, Crispus Attucks. So, as a small child, I was completely oblivious to the history and some of the realities. And I often think about, if I had known some of this information early on, how would have it affected me, and how would it have affected my consciousness in my life going forward? And to know that some of the photographs of, or not photos, but paintings, renderings of George Washington, and you got a Black man in the background, not knowing at that time that that Black man was George Washington's slave, who was fighting in the war because he was compelled to, because of his status as a slave. When I go back and look at the founding of the country in the United States Constitution, and in Article 2 of the United States Constitution that was adopted in 1788, there was a clause in it that established the electoral college system. And the electoral college system was established because during that time, Black people were not counted. They weren't considered as part of "we the people." But Black people were counted in the apportionment of Congress to give whites power in the South. So we were counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of representation in Congress, but we weren't allowed to vote or participate in the governmental process, and we didn't have any say. We were considered chattels or property. And during that time, this electoral college system served as a proxy system to count us, but to give white people the power of the vote based on our numbers. And so this was the system that was the United States Constitution. And so Black people fought, they struggled. Around 1900, you had a slave rebellion by Denmark Vesey. And then you had another slave rebellion by Gabriel Prosser. And then around 1835, you had a slave rebellion by Nat Turner. And so these are just a few of the well-known slave rebellions But during this particular period of time, there was a struggle because there was a group of people in the United States that, from coming from a British heritage, there was a debate in Britain over the issue of slavery. John Wesley, who was the founder of the Methodist church movement, had been a preacher in Georgia for a short period of time in the early to mid 1700s. And he, of course, returned to England, but after that, he became an outspoken opponent of slavery and said that slavery was a moral evil, that it was a sin. And so the church, a church movement developed, Methodism, but the church became very divided over the issue of slavery. And of course, ultimately, the church split up into two different factions, the southern portion that supported slavery and the northern portion that opposed slavery. The northern portion of the Methodist Church in the United States became part of the abolitionist movement and supported gaining freedoms for the African slaves. So we can go through this history and look at, for example, the Missouri Compromise came about as a result of this tension between the slave supporters and the people that opposed slavery. So this Missouri Compromise made some of the territories that were purchased in the Louisiana Purchase, some portion of it was slave and some portion of it was free. And in 1850, there was a Fugitive Slave Act because many Africans were trying to flee to escape slavery and go to free states. But the Congress allowed slave catchers to then travel across state lines and go into the free areas and recapture slaves that had escaped and take them back into slavery. So there was a tension that developed in the country that ultimately led in a Supreme Court decision in 1857 called the Dred Scott decision. And in that decision, the Supreme Court decided that Black people, Africans, were never intended to be part of the United States and that we had no rights under the Constitution. And so in essence, they were saying that when the Constitution said we the people, it did not include Black people. And so this created a dilemma because you had about 4.5 million Black people in the United States, about 4 million enslaved Black people, and about 500,000 free Black people. And the question became, what is their status at this point? Because they are not, in essence, citizens of the United States, but yet they are here. And so ultimately, this culminated in the Civil War that began in 1861, when the southern states seceded and broke away from the United States, in essence, committed treason against the United States, and a civil war followed. And so ultimately, the North won, and the 13th Amendment was adopted in 1865, and this 13th Amendment outlawed slavery. Then the 14th Amendment was adopted that conferred citizenship. And its actual purpose was to confer citizenship upon the newly freed slaves. And so Black people became citizens of the United States in 1868 as a result of the adoption of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. And then Black males were given the right to vote in 1870 under the 15th Amendment. And as a consequence of that, a record number of Black people were elected into the United States Congress. And you had actually 2 Black US senators. And then, of course, after the Reconstruction was stopped, because there was a deal between the Democrats and Republicans that resulted in the withdrawal of federal troops from the southern states. And then the southern states were free to deny voting rights to Black people. And it basically resulted in Blacks having the inability to gain representation in Congress. And another Black senator was not elected until the 1960s with Senator Edward Brooke. So in terms of looking at the history, one of the things they don't really want us to know or understand and talk about is the fact that from the time the Constitution was adopted in 1788 and went into effect in 1789 until 1868, Black people were not considered citizens of the United States as a matter of law. And this is a very important concept for us to wrap our heads around and to really take a look at, because although the lofty language, about, we the people, and, the Declaration of Independence and all of these things that took place, in essence, did not contemplate that Black people were, in essence, even human beings at the time. And so this is very critical to understanding the history and what has happened in the past. And it should impact the intensity in which we address the issues that confront us today. Because historically, Black people struggled and fought to gain freedom. Black people participated in the American Revolutionary War and fought. And then they were double-crossed and not given the opportunity to participate as citizens. They weren't allowed to vote. Black people conducted a number of different slave rebellions in order to attempt to force their freedom. And it basically created a momentum, a push going forward. And it just kept building up and building up and building up until the Supreme Court just openly said, well, Black people have no rights which whites are bound to respect. And when this occurred in 1857, in the Dred Scott decision, it crystallized the issue. The ambiguity was gone. The hope that somehow they would let us in was gone. And at that point, it became a critical issue. And then Black people and white people of goodwill came together, and they fought with intensity to change the system so that Black people could be included as the part of we the people, so that Black people would be recognized as human beings, so that Black humanity would be recognized, and that the image of God in man would be recognized as part of the Black heritage, that Black people were human beings, and that we had the status and right to be human beings and to be treated equally. And so this struggle, this intensity that built up, resulted in the Civil War and the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery in 1865, and Black people becoming citizens of the United States by way of the 14th Amendment in 1868. And so in terms of Black people, Black men gaining the right to vote by the 15th Amendment in 1870, And then the 19th Amendment wasn't adopted until 1920, which gave women the right to vote, including Black women. And so, in terms of looking at what has happened over time, and then ultimately the New Deal and how Black women played a role in the shift from the Republican to the Democratic Party, and how Black women played a role in bringing about Social Security, in bringing about public works programs, and brought about uh, uh, developing non-discrimination laws, and brought about um, changes in the social contract between the United States and its people, and particularly the Black people. And so, in terms of where we are now, there is a struggle of people that are opposing what they call critical race theory. And they don't want the children to talk about it. They don't want it talked about in the public schools. They don't want white children feeling guilt for what happened in the past. They don't want white children to feel any sense of responsibility for what has taken place in the past and the discriminatory conditions that developed, that existed, and that the legacy of those discriminatory conditions continue down to the present day. They don't want any knowledge to come forward that brings about accountability. And so we have a duty to share this information, to talk about this history, so that those things they don't want us to talk about, those things they don't want us to know, we have a duty to know these things, and a duty to understand these things, and a duty to continue to fight and struggle and move forward, because this is the legacy. This is part of our heritage in America. What is the heritage of the Black man and woman in America? It is struggle. It is an unrelenting fight for freedom. It's an relenting struggle to be accepted as human beings, to be recognized and respected as human beings, and to stand up for our families, for our children, and for a better future.